Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're looking at something pretty significant.
Mhm.
A proposed ban on some common food dyes here in the US. And this isn't just, some distant policy thing.
Wow, not at all.
It's about what you and your family might actually be eating. It brings up a lot of questions, really, about food safety regulations.
Definitely does.
So, our mission today is to kind of unpack this, look at the thinking behind the ban, the main arguments, and, well, what it could all mean.
And we're looking at excerpts from the actual video announcement, right?
Yeah.
To get it straight from the source.
Exactly. Get the real context.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the announcement, it kind of paints a bigger picture, doesn't it? It's not just about dyes.
Right. It seems to tie into this broader concern about, well, American health overall.
A perceived decline, certainly, over the last few decades. And food additives are presented as maybe part of that story.
Okay, so let's get into that historical piece. The speaker in the video makes this really striking comparison. 1960s health versus now. And they throw out this statistic. Back then, maybe 3% of kids had chronic diseases.
3%?
And now, they're saying it's around 60%, 60.
Well, it's a huge jump. Now, we should probably note, diagnostics and reporting have changed a lot since the 60s.
Sure, fair point.
That could account for some of the increase. But still, the scale of change they're talking about, it definitely makes you stop and think.
Absolutely. And they list a whole bunch of conditions they feel weren't really around, or at least not common back then.
It's quite a list. ADHD, neurological disorders, ADD, speech delay, language delay.
Tics, Tourette's, narcolepsy.
ASD, so autism spectrum disorder, juvenile diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, Crohn's.
Wow. Peanut allergies, other food allergies, eczema, asthma.
And even things like dropping fertility rates, earlier puberty in girls. It covers a lot of ground.
It really does. And the speaker frames this whole health decline in pretty serious terms. They call it an existential threat.
Yeah. Strong language. Yeah. Not just a health issue, but something that could affect, the nation's leadership, its values.
Like it could weaken the country somehow.
That seems to be the implication. They tie it to economic burdens, even military readiness, and they put a number on the cost, too.
Oh, right. The spending on chronic diseases.
Yeah, from basically zero back then, they say, to $1.8 trillion a year now.
1.8 trillion. That's astronomical.
It's presented as a huge drain. Absolutely.
And then there's that other statistic, the one about military service.
Oh, yeah. That 74% of American kids today apparently can't qualify.
74%. That really brings it home, doesn't it? Makes it very practical.
It does. I mean, the argument is clear. A less healthy population has ripple effects. Economy, national security, the whole thing.
So that's the backdrop. How do the food dyes fit into this big picture?
Well, the announcement frames banning these dyes as like a first step, an initial move to tackle this bigger issue of unhealthy stuff in our food.
Okay.
And there's that analogy they use, the petroleum-based additives one.
Right, saying if people want to eat petroleum, they should add it themselves at home.
Exactly. Pretty blunt. The idea being it shouldn't just be in the food without us really knowing or choosing.
And it seems like dyes are just the start, potentially. They mention other ingredients.
Yeah, looking at removing other things from school food where they legally can, and maybe tackling all food products eventually. It does sound like a broader agenda.
Okay. And they also touched on the relationship between the food industry and regulators.
There was that phrase, a dark shadow cast by the industry.
Suggesting, what, conflicts of interest, science getting pushed aside?
That seems to be the implication. A kind of skepticism about whether past regulations were really based on the best unbiased science, especially regarding dyes and maybe other additives.
Which explains why they're pushing for new scientific studies specifically on these additives.
Right. To build a stronger evidence base for whatever comes next, policy-wise.
It suggests they feel the current foundation for maybe food safety rules isn't quite solid enough.
Or at least needs a serious refresh with independent research.
No, it wasn't just dyes. Sugar got a lot of attention, too. And the language was strong.
Very strong. Called it poison.
Wow. And linked it directly to diabetes?
Yeah, reinforcing that chronic disease point. They shared that anecdote about pediatricians, how diabetes used to be rare in kids, and now...
They see it all the time. 1 in 3 kids, was it?
That's the figure they mentioned, 1 in 3. Which is, again, a huge shift.
And there were stats from the NIH, too, right? About how widespread diabetes and prediabetes are.
38% of teens and half of all adults. It really paints a picture of a major public health challenge.
Half of adults. That's staggering.
It is. And again, they framed it economically. comparing the cost of dealing with conditions like diabetes, mitochondrial disorders, they call them, to the military budget.
Trying to show it's just unsustainable.
But that seems to be the argument, both health-wise and financially.
There was also some pretty critical commentary about the food and pharma industries.
Yeah, suggesting maybe there's a profit motive in people not being perfectly healthy.
And that for things like ADHD, the focus is often on meds rather than looking at diet.
Exactly. Which raises some complex questions about incentives in the system, doesn't it?
Definitely. And they mentioned mass psychosis, like media coverage being influenced.
By advertising money from those same industries, yeah. Suggesting it might be hard for the public to get a clear picture sometimes. It's a provocative idea.
And the sugar point was really hammered home with that comparison.
Yep.
What was it? To crack cocaine?
Yeah, referencing Mark Hyman, highlighting just how addictive they believe sugar can be, especially for young people, driving that overconsumption.
So if they see sugar as such a problem but maybe can't just ban it outright, what's the plan there?
The focus shifts to information, empowering the public. So better labeling is key.
Making it really clear what's in the food.
Exactly. And they mentioned working with Congress, with the White House on that, because for something like sugar, you'd likely need broader policy changes.
It's interesting they also mentioned talking to the food companies.
Right, and apparently the companies themselves brought up this issue of like a patchwork of legislation, different rules in different states being a headache.
So maybe the industry would actually prefer a single national standard, even if it's stricter.
It potentially suggests an area where interests might align, or at least a desire for clarity. And the announcement did say some companies are already voluntarily looking into removing dyes.
Seeking guidance on how to do it.
Yeah, so maybe some willingness to adapt is there already.
So is there some kind of deal with the industry?
They were clear, no formal agreement. But they used the term understanding.
Okay.
And the approach, at least initially, seems to be collaborative, that honey not fire phrase.
Trying persuasion before regulation.
Seems like it. Using existing tools first before pushing for new laws or rules. But, you know, the possibility of future regulation is probably still on the table.
Makes sense. And throughout all this, the role of science kept coming up.
Absolutely central. The speaker really emphasized that a lack of really solid, comprehensive studies on these additives has been a problem.
Hampering our understanding of the effects.
That's the idea. So this initiative at the NIH to encourage research on these big public health questions, like the causes behind the rise in autism, it's about building that stronger scientific foundation.
And they mentioned U.S. life expectancy.
Yeah, pointing out it's basically stalled since 2012, even dropped during the pandemic, adding urgency to figuring out these health trends.
And linked to that science piece is transparency, right?
Yeah.
Getting information out there.
Definitely. They talked about creating an open source website with info on all food additives.
Making it accessible.
Right. And also encouraging private companies to create tools like apps. You scan a barcode.
And you see what's in the product, like that Yucca app they mentioned.
Exactly. Using technology to empower consumers. Though they did acknowledge that for mandatory labeling, you probably need Congress to act.
Okay, so lots of moving parts. Why focus on food dyes first, specifically? And they also mention autism as a top priority.
The rationale for dyes seemed to be partly perception that nobody wants to eat petroleum idea. It's maybe an easier starting point.
Plus, there is some existing science suggesting negative impacts, right?
Yes, on health and behavior, so it's not coming out of nowhere. And autism, well, the dramatic increase in prevalence is the driving force there.
What were the numbers they cited for autism?
From 1 in 10,000 historically to maybe 1 in 31 now, or even 1 in 20 for boys, plus the huge projected economic costs.
So just an urgent need to find answers.
Exactly. Find the causes, eliminate exposures. That's the goal presented.
And finally, they did touch on the political side of things a bit.
Acknowledge President Biden's previous action on Red Dye 3.
And mentioned wanting to work with Congress on labeling down the line.
Right. And interestingly, also expressed thanks to President Trump for past support and empowering the science team.
So a nod across the aisle, perhaps?
Could be seen that way. Maybe an attempt to frame it as a nonpartisan health issue.
Okay. So wrapping up this deep dive then, we've looked at this proposed ban on common food dyes, but it's really part of a much bigger conversation.
Definitely. About the rise in chronic diseases, the role our food might play, the industry's influence, the need for better science, more transparency.
And this initial approach of trying to work with the industry while holding regulation as a possibility.
It really brings up some fundamental questions for you, listening at home, about the food you eat, how it's regulated, and who you trust for information.
Yeah, the focus on getting better science and making things clearer through labeling seems like a key takeaway, a move towards being more informed.
Absolutely.
Which leads us to that final thought for you. Thinking about everything we've discussed today, what are the biggest questions you have now about our food supply and how it affects health? And looking forward, what balance do you think we need between government action, like regulation, and individual awareness or consumer choice in tackling these really big health concerns? Something to chew on.